Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Managing the Risk of Non-Compliance in AML whilst Reducing Total Cost of Ownership. My name is Jacob Thompson. I work at Refinitiv and I'm the Head of Market Development for Risk based here in London. I will be your host for today's session. Before we begin, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them during the session. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. During the webinar, we'll have a few polling questions for you to answer, so be ready. Make sure to check the webinar resources, which include the webinar slides and some useful content from both Refinitiv and FinScan. If you'd like to speak to a specialist to learn more, please indicate in the feedback survey or fill in your details in the Contact Us form. We will be sending you a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of today's slides in the next few days. So, to begin with, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First of all, Max Smith, Product Manager at Innovative Systems. Hi, Max.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, and Mike Meaden, Risk Marketing Manager at Refinitiv. Hi, Mike.
Good afternoon.
Very good. So to introduce this topic, I'm going to talk about the tension that inherently exists in AML compliance. Since the early 2000s, financial services firms and other regulated firms have been under ever-increasing regulatory scrutiny. Regulators have been heading in the same direction, albeit at different rates, and one of the outcomes for financial services firms has been the adoption of customer screening systems as part of an overarching AML program. We've witnessed an explosion of fines as organizations have fallen foul of their obligations. But at the same time, we've seen an explosion in headcount as organizations have added staff to deal with all aspects of compliance. In more mature markets, organizations have realized that simply adding more staff to compliance teams to run their AML programs isn't practical. And whether large or small, mature or new to the game, compliance teams should be looking at how they make their AML programs as efficient as possible while not incurring any unwanted additional risk, i.e. the risk of being non-compliant. And today, we'll be looking at ways to manage the total cost of ownership of the customer screening process. So what does the customer screening process look like? I suspect this process is familiar to most on this call, and in principle, it's pretty simple. Firstly, you take your list of customers, both new and old, but new and existing, and compare on a periodic basis with AML reference data, such as WorldCheck, using a matching engine. Once complete, you must review the matches. Customer names will either be not matched at all, which is generally considered good, low risk, and statistically probable, positively matched, and therefore present potential risk, which must be considered, possibly matched to one or more records, in which case remediation of all the possible matches is required to identify any genuine positive matches. And finally, there's a chance that risks are missed and false negatives are generated. The goal of an effective customer screening process is to identify potential risks in the customer base in line with the organization's risk appetite, and to do this as efficiently as possible without generating inaccurate matches, i.e. false positives, or worse, missing matches, false negatives. An efficient process is one where effectiveness is achieved with the lowest total cost of ownership. So let's look at what makes up this cost. So the total cost model is well represented by an iceberg. The above the waterline are the visible costs. These include the technology costs, the connectivity to core banking, the KYC platform, the name matching system, and so on. It also includes the cost of AML risk intelligence data that you might use, such as WorldCheck. The less visible but more sizable costs are the operational costs associated with the downstream process. This is the cost of people completing incomplete CDD data. It's the cost of people required to work cases created by multiple matches and other such activities. And it's the indirect cost of employing these people, office space, lighting, management, HR, etc. The objective of this webinar is to demonstrate to you what can be done to manage those costs below the line through the smart use of high-quality AML reference data and upstream customer data preparation. The objective is to reduce the total cost of ownership without creating any additional risk of non-compliance. So that's the intro over. Now, to check you're still listening, we're going to go to the audience with a polling question. So here's the first polling question. Within your own organization, if you had to estimate, what's your current match rate in your customer screening platform? Please pick from one of the answers below and pick now. 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 plus, or I have no idea. Cool. So thanks very much. I'm going to bring Max into the conversation now. Max, what do you make of these results? What do you think?
Thanks, Jacob, and hi again, everyone. Thanks for having me on. These are some pretty interesting results we have here. Certainly, I think one that I want to call out right away is the percentage of people that have no idea. That's a little bit, concerning to me. It's something you definitely want to get a grip on, because without really understanding that, it's going to be really hard to understand that total cost of ownership, which is really what's going to help you when you're talking to the board, and really when you're talking to the risk as well, understanding your complete program. The other two categories, 0 to 5% and 20+%. That can be pretty standard depending on which specific set of data you're screening against. So, when you have a complete risk intelligence data platform such as WorldCheck, and you have politically exposed people and negative news and sanctions, you're going to get different matching rates against those different sets. So this doesn't look too out of the ordinary given that categorization of the different data sets. I'm going to get into a little bit about the upstream data quality piece that Jacob was just mentioning. So again, the customer data coming into your matching system and screening against that AML reference data. One of the challenges that people have is that data quality of that internal data is often ignored, and it poses a really big risk. It can actually drive up those false positives and the false negative risk. And I think typically when people see those challenges, they think, this is a matching configuration issue, or this is a tuning problem, when in reality, data quality plays a massive part in that entire process. And even worse is that the compliance officers like yourselves on the line don't have any control over the quality of that data. Usually it's a way upstream process. It's something that's commonly thought of as an IT task. There's really nothing you can do about it, even though you're responsible for the consequences of that bad data coming in. Again, that can lead to increased false negative risk, as well as the potential to miss other matches. So the question here is, how do you empower compliance professionals like yourselves to easily get better data quality, which is going to help you with more accurate screening program holistically? Which leads to another question, which is, I think, the question that everybody should be asking is, your data might be fine for other purposes. Again, maybe in the core application systems it's fine, but is it good enough for compliance, for your purposes, for what you're in charge of? And so there's a couple different ways that you can potentially improve your data. And just in my experience and what I've seen working with our customers, one of the big reasons for concern is duplication. So maybe you have multiple data sources that you're screening, different systems within the business that present different levels of risk, and you're feeding them into your matching engine to screen against your various AML reference data sets. If you have a profile in each one of those systems, you are going to be screening those names over and over and over again, and that's going to be wasted remediation effort on your end, obviously going to produce a lot of false positives. And so that's one reason when you bring in multiple sources. Another reason that these duplicates exist are poor data governance controls up front. Maybe instead of finding a profile in one of those systems, someone on the front end of the house is just adding a secondary profile. So you don't have those checks, so you might get duplicates within the same system. Ideally, what you'd want to see is that when you have those duplicate alerts that are generated from profiles out of the same, that those would be collapsed, consolidated, and you would only have to review one alert in your system. Again, that's preventing those false positives, which aren't false positives in the traditional sense, where it's not a true match, but that there are multiple matches for the same individual on the customer end. Just to give a couple more examples of what exactly we mean for data quality, because again, this does have a real impact on the compliance organization. This isn't just an IT problem. These are challenges that I'm sure you've run into in your day-to-day. The first one might be joint accounts. You have multiple names on a given record. Maybe this is coming from a legacy system, from one of your account-based systems. And in that system, this is perfectly fine. This is a perfectly fine way to store account-based information. But for screening purposes, there's clearly two names here, clearly two cases of risk, and you want to be able to split those out and separate those into two separate groups. And so you want to be able to screen each person individually with that information you have. This is going to help make sure that no matches are missed. And it can also reduce the false positives. It depends how loose or tight your matching criteria is, which way it'll go. But it will help both of those types of risk. The next example I have is understanding organizations and hidden names. And this one's particularly powerful because it demonstrates that false negative risk. For most of the systems out there, you're probably just feeding in the first line of a potential name and address record. So in this example, you might only be screening Sharp Corporation. Again, this might be perfectly clean data quality upstream in terms of a supplier management system, but for compliance purposes, there's clearly two separate organizations here. There's a holding company on the second line. You need to make sure you're identifying that holding company. In this example, there's actually this is actually an OFAC hit that you would have missed in your screening platform if you're not pulling out those beneficiaries, people that are care of and trust for holding companies. There's names on the second line that are hidden in these legacy records that are coming in that you want to make sure that you're pulling out. In addition, there's some noise words on the lines as well. So a word like corporation or company might raise false positives because there's going to be a lot of records that have corporation and company in the name. You want to make sure you're screening the name, pieces of the organization name that are actually relevant, that are going to give you the true matches on the list that you're screening against. And this example just kind of brings it all together. It has a little bit of everything. On the first line here, we can see some noise words, some dummy data that we'd want to remove, the word bank refund. And we see that there are an individual and an organization on the second lines. So not only would you see false positive alerts based on that word at the very or that sequence of words at the very beginning, but additionally you'd be missing the matches associated with the individuals on the second and third lines. So again, there's a lot of different challenges with the data coming in that can cause a lot of problems on the back end, particularly as it pertains to the false negative and the false positive risk. And this is the last example that I'll mention, just standardizing data elements. I think this one should be pretty common. Everyone's probably familiar with this. You have different ways to represent a country. In this case, we have Korea and North Korea. There's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Different, exonyms and things like that. And then for dates, there's plenty of different date formats. Day, month, order, month, day, spelling out the name of the month. Plenty of different ways that you can pass that in. The important piece is that you need whatever you're passing in from your customer data to match whatever is on the data set that you're screening against, WorldCheck, OFAC, whatever it is. So you want to make sure you standardize that so it's lining up, because what can happen is, if the date is in month day order, and you're using date of birth as one of your matching criteria, you might actually be missing results because you're filtering them out because the compliance data set is in day month order. So it's really important to line those up and make sure it all comes together smoothly within your program. Some of the warning signs, some of the things that we've seen ourselves that indicate that there might be data quality issues within the organization are that there's difficulty getting that data for screening. So you know that you need to screen a certain source or a particular application within your organization, but you can't get it. You're waiting on IT to get that to you. You might be clearing the same alerts. And again, that could come from that duplication problem. If you have a profile for an individual in 10 different systems that you're screening into the matching engine, you might say, well, wait a second, I cleared this person yesterday. Why are they back? If you're undergoing a merger or an IT transformation, again, you're bringing together different data sets that might have different formats, different standards. Again, you need to line that up and make sure that your program is holistically accounting for those different data nuances. If you're adding new data sources, obviously for the same reason, because of the standardization, and if you're having difficulty kind of keeping track of it all and understanding where is this information in your organization coming from as it's coming into your compliance process, you really want to have control over that, understand it in and out. That way, when the regulator comes, you can explain that clearly to them, and there's no cause for doubt. So I talked about a bunch of different examples here, and I think that this is kind of the point that brings it all together. How do you get started? How do you tackle this problem? If you're in the audience and you're hearing me say this, and one of those examples resonated with you, or you know that you had a quality challenge, what can you do about that? How do you really get started? And I think the most important point is doing some sort of data analysis type of initiative. I think that this is how we've seen, clients in the industry that we've interacted with be successful. Is they really get a complete understanding of the problem before they begin. Each institution, each company, maybe in each department within a company, is going to have a potential different set of data challenges. So you want to make sure that you're identifying the data challenges that are unique to you up front, understanding what impact they're going to have on your screening process and your overall compliance program, and then specifically targeting those and resolving them in a way that makes sense, again, for your specific organization. And as part of doing that, you can help map out what kind of either risk reduction this is giving you in terms of the false negative risk that you can reduce, as well as what kind of operational efficiency you can gain towards that total cost of ownership piece that Jacob was talking about from a false positive efficiency standpoint. Definitely, this is the planning step, and this is the way to get talking about this in a structured way. So we have one more poll here as well, and this is how would you best describe the current condition of your data used for compliance screening purposes? Now that we've taken a little time and spoken about what exactly we mean by data quality for compliance, how do you see your organization tackling this problem? We have 4 answers here. We have fundamental issues in our data, not good even with procedures to address data issues, we have no issues in our data, or I don't know. I guess we'll give it a couple seconds for some people to respond. All right, looks like we have oh, they might still be coming in. I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, we'll bring up the results. Oh, sorry, one too far. So this is what we're looking at. We have a pretty interesting split here. So I think it's interesting that at least a quarter of you have identified that you have some fundamental issues in your data. It's good that you know, it's good that you're aware of it. That's definitely the first step in starting to tackle what you can do about it. The second one is interesting. Not good even with procedures to address the data issues, and there's a healthy amount of those as well. And again, that's because this is traditionally seen as an IT problem, and maybe you have a data quality team, maybe you have data quality tools and processes, upstream in the core operational systems, but they're not giving you what you need for compliance purposes. We have no issues in our data. This is something that we've heard many, many times, and we've seen that it depends what you mean by issues and what you see. One of the things that we'd recommend is doing a data analysis to help prove that out. Make sure that there's nothing that you can be gaining, that there aren't any efficiencies or risks that you might be unaware of that you don't think you have. And if everything is clean and you do that analysis and have that documented, that's one more tool in your shed when the regulator comes to help you say, we've made sure that not only is our screening process good, but the data that's feeding into that process is good as well. So we'd recommend that data analysis regardless. But it is good to see that most people don't think that they have a problem. And then lastly, I don't know, again, to the data analysis point, if you don't know, you don't know what you're missing. So absolutely the analysis is the best way to move forward from that. I will leave everyone with just a sample data condition checklist. I talked about a couple of these with specific examples earlier in the presentation, but this is just a sample checklist of some of the things you should be checking for, some of the things you should be aware of. I'm not going to read through these one by one, but the point is that there are a lot of different things that we've seen, in our experience that do have a meaningful impact on your screening program, and so doing some sort of data analysis to help understand those and start to prevent those is very important. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Mike, who's going to talk about the data quality on the AML reference data side from his experience. Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Max. Hello, everyone. Again, this is Mike Meaden speaking from Johannesburg in South Africa. Thank you very much for joining and for your attention. And Max, thanks again for your presentation. I thought that was very interesting. So I'm going to tackle the problem from the other side, as it were. So Max has been spending some time talking about getting the KYC end of this process right. So in other words, cleaning up and making sure you have all the right KYC data in order to produce productive matches. On the other side of that, you also need to think through, at a fundamental level, your screening program design, because that will determine what reference data you will use, how you will screen it, when you will screen it, how often you will screen it, and so on. And I just want to start with taking a step back, as it were, and ask, what is the purpose of screening? Because I think we perhaps don't ask ourselves that question enough. Because screening is not an end in itself. It is, of course, a means to an end, and specifically, it's meant to be a risk management control with certain objectives. I will urge you to think through what your objectives are when you're designing your screening program, and you should do so wearing two hats. The one hat is a compliance hat. There's a set of regulatory obligations that says, thou shalt do A, B, C, and D. But also from a risk management perspective, because of course in a lot of jurisdictions, there is a risk-based approach that you can follow, and even if it's beyond what's required by compliance, it may be appropriate from a risk management perspective, and that is managing your customer risk. In other words, the risk that your customer is going to use your products to launder the proceeds of crime, by going beyond what is just merely required in a piece of legislation or regulation. And I just want to emphasize an important point is that screening is not a perfect control, and it's not the only control you need, and it's not all-purpose. It's not perfect by any means, but it is an important control. So let's talk through a handful of typical objectives that companies are trying to achieve by engaging in screening. The first is detecting sanctions targets, and that can either be in their customer database, even their suppliers potentially. It could be in the instruments they deal. So, for example, they could be sanctioned instruments, or it could be in transactions. And it's very important to do screening to detect potential sanctions matches in order to meet your regulatory obligation. The second is PEP identification. This is an absolutely key one. Most legislation, and of course the Financial Action Task Force, requires you to identify politically exposed people who you're doing business with, and then do a series of things around them. The first is typically some kind of enhanced due diligence or further due diligence. And typically there's also some kind of process required to get senior management sign-off on PEPs. Thirdly, there's also a sense of wanting to detect other high-risk clients. There are risks, of course, outside of sanctions and PEPs, And a lot of clients use screening as a control or a means of detecting such high-risk clients. So, for example, individuals with adverse media, credible allegations that they're involved in the drug trade, for example. A fourth key use case is risk ranking. A lot of firms will systematically and algorithmically risk rank their entire customer database, and screening is an important input into that. It's possible to risk rank without screening, but it's not necessarily going to be precisely accurate if you do it that way. And then finally, there's another bucket of finding other types of risks. Depending on your risk appetite and your firm's particular view of risk, you may, for example, have a reputation to uphold of being a firm with a particular type of way of doing business. And again, the screening is a control that might help you detect such risks. And there's also, increasingly, we're seeing our clients doing transaction lookbacks as an additional control on top of screening. So that's not real time, that's retrospective. And it's very important to think through what are you trying to achieve when you're doing this type of program design. And your specific objective will determine exactly what you screen against what data, how often. I'm not going to spend much on this. So Jacob has done, I think, an excellent job with that iceberg to explain the nature of your total cost of ownership. And it's most definitely the case in any client I've ever dealt with that their costs are overwhelmingly being driven by the operational component. And I just to unpack a little bit further, what is your operational cost actually related to? And you can work through the math here, but I think it's easier to move on to a couple of maxims that I've got. But broadly speaking, your operational cost is going to be proportional to your alert volume, so the number of alerts your system generates, and to how efficiently your staff can deal with alerts, and also how efficiently your staff can do EDD. But I don't want to get stuck in the minutiae, so let's just focus on the maxims that I've mentioned. So these are, rules of thumb. So ceteris paribus, all things being equal, I found these following statements to be true. The more names you screen or the more customers you screen, the more alerts you get. That's pretty obvious. The second is the more AML data you screen against, the more alerts you get. Again, fairly obvious. So a database of 1 million names versus a database of 5 million names, you get more results if you screen against the 5 million. The third, and this is where Max's section becomes very important, is the better and more complete your KYC data. I put KYX because it could be vendor, it could be other type of know your X. But the better and more complete your KYX data is, the fewer alerts you will get. Fourth, the better quality AML data you use, the fewer alerts you get. The fuzzier your matching, the more alerts you get. Now, there's always this trade-off between should I do exact matching or nearly exact matching, or should I go fuzzy, and how fuzzy name matching do I go? And that you need to take a risk-based approach to that, and you're ultimately trading off your false positives versus your false negatives. And then finally, the fewer secondary identifiers you use, and by secondary identifiers I mean further identification information about an individual, their age, their date of birth, their gender, their location, their nationality, etc. And the fewer of these you have, and the more alerts you will get. Now, I think these hold true. I hope they hold true in your experience. But I want to end off this particular slide by just encouraging you to take a risk-based approach to deciding what you're going to screen against which lists using what parameters. And by parameters, I mean the tuning of the software system you use. And by which lists, I mean a risk-based approach to list management, which we'll come into a bit more detail. And I quite like this concept of a Goldilocks zone. You might have heard in planetary astronomy. That's the zone where liquid water can occur, so a particular distance from a particular star, so the Earth is in the Goldilocks zone where life can occur around the sun. And I'd like to think that there's a Goldilocks zone on the due diligence continuum from do nothing to do no business at all because you're so risk averse. Somewhere in the middle there's a Goldilocks zone depending on your policy, your inherent risks, your risk appetite, etc., where you find a balance between the risks you're willing to take and those you're not. So I just want to make a couple of comments. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm going to try to power through these about what criteria you should use or think through when you're deciding on what kind of AML reference data to use. The core requirement is always to find a data set that is comprehensive, importantly one that's deduplicated. It must be consistent, accurate, configurable, up to date. And it's very important that it allows you to screen against different types of sets of data that are all geared towards compliance to AML CFTs, so countering financing of terrorism and countering proliferation financing risks. And typically such data sets would include sanctions data, PEPs data, and that would include RCAs or relatives of, and close associates of PEPs, various law enforcement lists or watch lists, and similarly various regulatory or regulatory lists or watch lists. And in a little bit more detail, I'd say it's very important reliability, accuracy, global comprehensiveness. But that third bullet I would highlight in particular, it's very important to have a highly analytical approach to what is included in a database like this. And the example I always use is, who exactly is a PEP? That seems like quite a straightforward question until you delve into the details. And different countries, even different countries within the EU, which in theory should all have the same or very much the same money laundering legislation because of the 4th and the 5th money laundering directives, there is actually some variation on who's considered a PEP. For example, Czech Republic and Cyprus have slight variations on the PEP definition in the 4th money laundering directive. And it's very important to not think every public official is a PEP. I've seen that sometimes clients use that, which is not appropriate because only a subset of public officials are PEPs, and of course not all PEPs are public officials. It's also very important, just like it is in the KYC data that Max was referring to, that you deduplicate across different sources. And this is very, very important, and it's very nicely illustrated. I hope you can see it relatively clearly in that little graph on the right. This shows you the raw names on the left-hand side and the bar chart of the major sanctions bodies, and then it shows you how many there are deduplicated. So there's roughly 20,000 names with duplicates and roughly 9,600 without duplicates. And that highlights the danger if you're using duplicated AML reference data and you're matching duplicated customer data from the KYC end, you're adding false positives upon false positives. And then finally, the last two things that are, I think, very important when you're making a decision about which AML reference data provider to use is to choose one that takes operational cost issues very seriously and allows you to configure and select lists in a very configurable way, allowing you to take a risk-based approach to list management. I want to talk about the problem of overscreening. Again, I'm going to try to be quite fast. I've already spoken a little bit about the definition of a PEP. There is no globally consistent definition. There's various guidance, so there's the FATF guidance, but unfortunately that guidance is relatively vague. The same for the Wolfsburg guidance. It is relatively vague as soon as you delve into the details. So a key example of overscreening occurs where clients will screen against lists of PEPs that either from a compliance perspective or from a regulatory perspective or a risk perspective, they're not actually required to. My favorite go-to example here is Peru recently changed their PEP definition to include all candidates for office as PEPs. Now, that if you're a European financial institution, there's no obligation to screen candidates for office. And he would argue from a first principles risk perspective, does a candidate for office represent a high money laundering risk? You might have a different view to me, but I suspect the risk is relatively low. And the problem of over-screening occurs where you, without thinking through your own regulatory requirements and your own risks, you just screen against all the PEPs you can find, or you screen against all the PEPs that are on WorldCheck. I would encourage you not to do that. To move to a slightly different example is in sanctions. I've seen this happen repeatedly with clients where they're screening against sanctions lists from irrelevant sanctions bodies that are geographically distant. So I've seen clients who are based in Africa screen against Monaco's sanctions list. If there's no obligation to screen against such lists, check what your policy says you ought to be screening, and then go through what you're supposed to be screening. Another example is Kenya issues sanctions under the Kessel WorldCheck keyword. Unless you've got operations in Kenya or exposure to Kenya, there's no obligation to you as a UK financial services firm to screen against Kenyan sanctions. So think through what you're screening and why. There's also a tendency sometimes of over-screening all adverse media or all watch lists regardless of risk. And this is a key driver of operational cost. And then much more rarely, but I've seen this occasionally where financial institutions or others will screen entirely inappropriately. So for example, they're a bank and they're screening their payments prior to execution against PEP data. Typically, you would only screen sanctions. So that's, broadly speaking, the problem of over-screening, perhaps clearest when it comes to PEPs. Then I want to just highlight the extent to which AML reference data has grown over the last couple of years. On the left-hand side, this is the total number of records on WorldCheck. This has grown 270% in the last couple of years, and you can see clearly why. On the right-hand side, you'll be able to see the number of new records we've created, the number of records we've updated, and also the number of records we've deleted, which has increased in recent years. But the reason over-screening is such a driver of operational cost is that 10 years ago, AML databases had a couple of 100,000 PEPs. WorldCheck alone is now just shy of 2 million PEPs on the full database. And this is being driven by this plethora of PEPs. If you're a Peruvian financial institution, of course, you need to be screening against candidates for office. We've got lots of clients in Peru, so we cover those PEPs per that local definition for our local clients. But if you're an Italian insurance company, there's no obligation to screen them. So the growth of the AML reference data is a very, very important thing to keep in the back of your mind, and this drives operational cost unless you take a risk-based approach of deciding what you're going to actually screen against. So there are, broadly speaking, when it comes to actually designing a risk-based screening program, there are, broadly speaking, 3 questions you need to ask yourself. What are you screening? Against what lists? The timing of that screening, so when, and also how often are you rescreening? Now, typically what you're screening, the most basic thing people screen are customer names. So it's the name of the individual or the entity with which you're doing business. Increasingly, that's being expanded to related parties. So for entities like a company, that would include officers and directors and UBOs. For trusts, it would include things like trustees and beneficiaries. But it's also expanding in other ways. For example, there's increasingly a requirement to screen the beneficiaries of life insurance policies, for example. A very typical thing that also gets screened are names that appear on payment instructions. So typically cross-border, but sometimes even domestic payments. A lot of clients screen employees as well. I just want to highlight that if you are a WorldCheck client, please don't screen U.S. persons against U.S. employees against WorldCheck. That is limited by our contract. In addition, people are increasingly screening their suppliers and other third parties, and also dual-use goods lists, reference data for sanctioned securities like ISIN. Furthermore, here's the heart of the problem. Against what reference data are you actually going to be screening against? And step one, let's just cover off sanctions. Do the hard work up front and determine in your policy and determine in your risk-based approach which sanctions regimes do you actually need to comply with. Do you or do you not need to comply with the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Kenya? If the answer is no, you should not be screening the KESL keyword on WorldCheck as an example. And bear in mind if you're an entity with operations in several jurisdictions, so let's just say you have an operation in the UK and in China, or even better, let's say you're an operation in the UK and in Kenya, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to screen the Kenyan sanctions list in the UK. Your UK entity can screen what it needs to screen: EU, UK, HMD, OFAC, etc. And your Kenyan entity can screen all of those plus the KESL keyword as one example. Then, and this can be quite challenging, create an institutional definition of what you consider to be a PEP. Have a definition in mind, and importantly, look at what your regulatory requirement is. In a piece of legislation, there will always be a definition of who a PEP is. Create a definition based around that, but also take into consideration the risks you face in the jurisdictions you operate. Then, a very important question, and there's no consensus about this internationally, is for how long after a PEP has left office are they considered a PEP? According to the Fourth Money Laundering Directive, you should treat someone as a PEP for at least 12 months after they leave office. But there is a lot of variation. A lot of legislation is silent on this question, unfortunately, but increasingly jurisdictions are adding this. South Africa's 12 months, Botswana's 5 years. Canada, domestic PEPs, 5 years. Foreign PEPs, once a PEP, always a PEP. So determine as part of when you're creating your institutional PEP definition, think through when a PEP is no longer a PEP. And then finally, decide on when and under what circumstances you're going to screen what types of adverse media. So if you operate in a particular jurisdiction, it might be really relevant to screen a most wanted list from that jurisdiction. So if you operate in the United States, the FBI most wanted list is perhaps quite important for you. Much less important could be the Azerbaijani wanted list. If you don't operate there, if you don't have exposure to that jurisdiction, and there's no risk from Azerbaijanis in general in your business, there's no reason to screen that list. And then finally, it's how often. And I phrased this as two questions. Are you going to do this real time, or are you going to do this as T plus X, so T plus 1 or 2 or 3? Typically, sanctions, the view I see from our clients is sanctions needs to be done real time. Something like PEP screening, however, can be done T plus 1, for example. And how often are you going to be screening? Are you going to be screening only at onboarding and then at defined periods thereafter, at every 2 years or 3 years? Or are you going to do daily ongoing screening? I will say periodic screening, the experience of a lot of banks is that creates enormous headaches. It is better to do ongoing screening and do a consistent amount of work throughout the year than have these spikes of massive remediation volume that come in once you rescreen every couple of years. And then finally, and this is very important to managing operational costs, decide under what conditions you will rescreen a name you've already remediated. And that comes from two angles. from the KYC side and also from the reference data side. What kind of change in a KYC record requires rescreening? A change of name, a change of date of birth, the addition of an ID number could be good reasons. Someone moving from one suburb of London to a different suburb of London might not be. And then you also need to think through what changes to the reference data, so to the records on a system like WorldCheck, is material enough for you to actually consider rescreening them. And I will talk now about a couple of ways in which, if you're a WorldCheck client, you can make use of the features that we have in WorldCheck to manage your operational cost, tied into what I've just been saying. And just a note there on the top right-hand corner, there is the dreaded asterisk. So if you see an asterisk next to one of these features, just please bear in mind that requires access to the WorldCheck advanced flavor of our data, previously known as premium. You might have heard that term. So the first one is update categorization. That is what I've just mentioned, and my apologies that I will power through these quite fast. Update categorization systematically rates every update made to WorldCheck based on the materiality of that change. So just like moving from one suburb to another isn't sufficient to rescreen, perhaps the fact that the WorldCheck team has fixed the spelling or grammatical error in the further information field of a record and added one more source is not sufficient for you to rescreen. And update categorization uses strict rules to define which updates to which fields fall into which category, either C1, C2, C3, or C4. And that little pie chart shows you the percentages that fall into each of those. A brilliant way, and one of the easiest ways to minimize your operational cost, is to implement update categorization. The second, and this is something we are busy launching, phase 1 is launching in WorldCheck, and it's called PEP expiration. And this comes to the question of, for how long after a PEP has left office are you going to be treating them as a PEP? We're not going to answer that question for you. You determine that in your policy, but we will provide you with structured fields whereby you can say after 18 months, after 2 years, after 5 years, whatever period you decide upon, you will no longer wish to treat someone as a PEP, and there will be a PEP start date, PEP end date, and an overall status provided for each PEP on the WorldCheck database. Please just note we are launching this feature for the UK, Canada, and South Africa, so specifically the records from those 2 countries, the PEPs from those 3 countries, I should say, and then throughout the year, the rest of the world will be populated. The third point is just the focus on which we have put in the last couple of years on identifying further secondary identifiers, and that graph should give you an indication. Not sure you can see it very clearly, but the principle is we are spending a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of resources in ensuring we're capturing whatever secondary identifiers we can find with a particular focus on date of birth. Then also something that's very important is the WorldCheck data is highly structured. Every record is in exactly one category. It is assigned to a particular country, so the person is from a particular country. PEP records will have position fields, so member of parliament, senior official SOE, etc. And a lot of our data is also keyworded. So law enforcement sanctions and regulatory enforcement data are all keyworded. So if you wanted to download or screen against all and only the OFAC or UK HMT records in the category individual from Afghanistan, you could do so very easily using these structured fields. The next one is the PEP subcategories. Now, PEP subcategories allow you to risk rank your customers on a systematic basis because it categorizes all the PEPs on the WorldCheck database based on their seniority, including, for example, national level PEPs, members of parliament, presidents, prime ministers, and so on, all the way down to PEP-Ls or local PEPs, for example, mayors of small cities, etc. Now, this is very important in combination with the other structured fields to avoiding PEP over screening. So the example I gave you earlier of candidates for office being PEPs in Peru, if you wanted to exclude those PEPs from your screening, you'd simply have to exclude PEP-Ls and their relatives and associates from country equals Peru, and you can avoid screening all of those names and thus reduce the number of alerts you get and thus your operational cost. The final three items, dynamic downloads, is a feature specifically in the data file that allows you to access these highly categorized data and combine them in various complex ways. And just to let you know, we are working on something. There's an early access program at the moment for some of our large clients with something called advanced dynamic download, which will extend the ability even further. It will power your ability to slice and dice the data and get exactly what you want and only what you want going forward. The final two, field updates. It lets you know exactly what has changed in each record when it gets updated to give your operational staff a chance. Well, okay, I've gotten re-alerted on a particular profile. Maybe it's a PEP. Why is the case? Assuming you've implemented update categorization, it's likely to be a material change. But what has changed? It could be the position, the person has assumed a more senior PEP position, for example, or it could be that this person has now been accused of corruption. And obviously, in the latter instance, you might want to do EDD, potentially off-board this particular client. And this feature allows your operational staff to identify such changes much more rapidly. And then finally, and this is important, I think, for a lot of our clients, particularly across EMEA, is the ability to screen not just in English or Latin script, but in 49 different languages, everything from Arabic to Chinese, both traditional and simplified, Russian, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, Hebrew, Cyrillic, Hungarian, etc. And this is very important because of the inefficiency of machine transliteration. So matching a native character, if you're capturing Arabic in your systems, you can match against the native Arabic on a system like WorldCheck, thereby reducing both false positives and false negatives. And that is where I will end it. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, but I'm going to hand back to Jacob.
So thank you, Mike. Thank you very much, and thank you to Max. I think hopefully the audience is finding this useful. We have some questions here, but I think we've certainly delivered some practical ways to reduce the size of the proverbial iceberg. But Max, I have a question I'm going to pose to you. It goes like this. It says, thanks guys, you covered a lot today, and it's clear that we need something like this. How do we convince our management to invest in data challenges? Can you have a stab at that, Max?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks whoever in the audience asked that question, and thanks Jacob for asking me. I think that I touched on the point about the data analysis, and I think that that's an important step to helping with the management. If we look back to that total cost of ownership iceberg that Jacob was talking about in the very beginning, I think if you're trying to figure out how much of that you can meld away, you need to know exactly what you can get rid of and how you can improve the program. And I think it's not worth it just throwing in data quality tools or processes on the KYC side. You certainly have to do an analysis and get an in-depth understanding of what challenges your organizations are facing, which might not be obvious. They might not be apparently obvious what those challenges are. But once you understand what your false positive and your false negative risk are, and what you can do to reduce those, for instance, through deduplication, right? You remove, that's one more record that an analyst doesn't have to review. You can pretty easily build a business case that has, cents or pounds and pence attached to the attached to it. So, at FinScan, we have our history in the data quality space. We've been doing this for 50 years. So we offer a number of different tools, the analysis and the remediation of those specific those specific challenges. Us or someone else, we recommend that you definitely start there. The data analysis is extremely important.
Fantastic. Thank you, Max. And Mike, I have a question here for you with regards to AML reference data. How frequently are screening sources updated, especially adverse media?
So I'm going to give two answers to that question, a slightly unhelpful answer and then a slightly more helpful answer. The unhelpful answer is as often as possible. So we have, as WorldCheck, I can't speak for other reference data providers, we've got 400 analysts speaking 65 languages across 4 continents, constantly looking at publicly available information, including adverse media, to detect, find out terrorists, people accused of corruption, and so on. That's the unhelpful answer. We do as well as we can. This is a summary of that one. A slightly more helpful answer is there's been a very strong focus on increasing the frequency with which we update data. From the graph I showed a little bit earlier, you would have seen quite a dramatic increase, and maybe if I go back to that slide, I can just talk through it. So in the red line shows you the number of records we've updated on a monthly basis. You can see a very steady increase. We're now averaging anything between 80 to 100,000 updates a month as WorldCheck, which is very significant. That's across everything. Roughly 1/5 of our data, so 20% odd, would be adverse media. So a lot of those records are being created, being updated, and there's also a minimum time with which we will revisit a record to make sure that it's up to date. So there's a cold case team. If a record hasn't been updated for 2 or 3 years, they will go back. Is it still relevant? What else can we find about it, etc.
Thank you, Mike. Look, we're up against the hour here, so we did get a few more questions, but I'm not going to pose them because we're going to run out of time. So really, to the audience, thank you very much for joining the webinar, and also thank you to Max and to Mike for joining me in presenting this webinar. You've both been fantastic, much appreciated. For the audience, you will receive a follow-up email, including the slides in a couple of days. Please do fill in the survey that appears once the webinar is finished. And if you'd like to talk to somebody from Refinitiv and FinScan, you can note that in the feedback. And once again, thank you very much for joining and have a great day. Cheers now.